As UN climate negotiations entered their decisive week in Madrid, young activists thronged the city's streets, demanding that world leaders get serious. At their head, Time magazine's Person of the Year, Greta Thunberg, whose school strikes sparked the worldwide movement Fridays for Future, focusing attention on the climate crisis as never before and helping spur initiatives like the new EU Commission's €1 trillion Green Deal. Many see the Madrid negotiations as the last chance to set the world on track to avoid a worst-case scenario. With evidence of the crisis effects mounting, many people are wondering whether the current climate anxiety comes too little, too late. And that's our topic. Welcome to the Point. We've got three top guests to explore where things stand. Stefan Rahmstorf is a professor of ocean physics who heads Earth systems analysis at the renowned Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He says the science is clear. We're facing catastrophic risks and we need to act fast to avoid them. It's time for decisive action, not for anxiety. Alan Posener is an influential blogger and commentator for the German newspaper Die Welt, and he says we need courage, not anxiety, in order to save the climate, democracy, capitalism, and the dream of a good life for everyone. Abandoning one of these aims will endanger all of them. And it's a pleasure to welcome Clara Meyer. She is spokesperson for Fridays for Future Berlin. And she says, while a certain fear shows real concern, it's important that this concern is now channeled into action, especially from large corporations and politicians who hold a great responsibility to pass legislation controlling this crisis. So, Clara, let me start out by asking you, what does this term, this phenomenon, climate anxiety, mean to you?
Well, I feel like it shows that people are realizing what catastrophe we're actually in. I feel like a lot of people are now realizing what is happening in Europe, seeing what is happening in the global south, and are simply afraid of what will come and what is already happening.
Climate anxiety, Stefan, is becoming now a recognized term for distress associated with global warming, including on the part of people who are not yet directly affected or appear not to be directly affected by catastrophic risks like the one you mentioned in your opening statement. Do you think this climate anxiety is a positive force that will actually stimulate the kind of change that you called for?
Well, I think, first of all, it's just a natural human reaction if you're faced with major threats for your future and the future of your children, that causes a certain amount of anxiety. The key thing is to not kind of lead that to you to suppress the problem and turn away from it, but rather to confront it and avoid these risks.
Alan, your opening statement seemed to suggest that you think climate anxiety could wind up being counterproductive.
Yes, I do. I mean, we have to fight climate change. The first person to say that, the first leader of a government to say that was Maggie Thatcher in 1989, one day before the fall of the Berlin Wall, in front of the United Nations. So this has been on the agenda for a long time. All I'm saying is, my caveat is that you mustn't allow climate anxiety to dominate everything else. I mean, you mustn't get into a position where you say, I'm so afraid of this change that we'll have to clamp down on democracy, individual rights, or I'm so afraid of climate change and catastrophic changes, which the scientists predict, that too bad, you guys in Africa and Asia and Latin America, we can't, we simply can't afford you to come up to our level. Stuff like that. I mean, I do think that we need to take a balanced view. Climate change is a real problem, just like, I don't know, fighting communism was a problem, just like fighting the Second World War against the Nazis was a problem, and it has to be tackled, but without giving up core values of our system. That's
which nobody suggests.
I think anxiety is a tool that we can use. I think anxiety is the first point that people reach, but that anxiety has to spur action. And that is the point where we're at right now. So we actually have to turn our anxiety into concrete action. This is the only way that we can solve this issue.
Clara, your movement, Fridays for Future, has tried to leverage climate anxiety and also anger, as we have clearly seen from Greta Thunberg, who has expressed that anger powerfully time and again. It's also provoked quite a backlash. Fridays for Future has come in for some very harsh attacks. So, first question, how do you personally deal with that? And secondly, do you ever worry that Fridays for Future, to some degree, is polarizing the debate in a way that could actually wind up turning some people off?
I think we're unifying the debate. I think we are the people that try to be the glue of society, try to push the people further. Because yes, we demand legislation from politics, we demand change from the large corporations who are responsible for over 70% of the world's carbon emissions, but that change has to be supported by the people. So that is what we're trying to do. And how I personally deal with hate, well, since most of the hate I get are rape threats and death threats, I don't take them seriously because I am very willing, and everyone I feel like in Fridays for Future is willing to engage in a constructive debate. But if people are just threatening you, frankly, that is not a debate, and it shows that certain people who are not willing to benefit our society as a whole, who are just that they criticize us with, well, even sometimes criminal means. I mean, there's even a group in Germany that, a very large Facebook group that threatens to drive cars into our demonstrations. And that is not a healthy debate at all.
Thank you for being so honest. Stefan, my own climate distress increased rather significantly after I saw the damage done to a coastal area in the U.S. that I have known since childhood. And I asked myself, when we see this heightened level now of anxiety and awareness, to what degree is it attributable to movements like Fridays for Future, and to what degree is it attributable to the fact that people are now starting to see physical changes in their own lives?
Well, I think it is both, and of course people are already affected, millions of people are affected by the increase in extreme weather events, extreme heat waves, extreme drought, flash floods, the fires, and so it hits home, close to home for more and more people. Just in the last 20 years, 500,000 people have died from the direct effects of extreme weather events, and these extreme weather events are on the rise. And for a long time, the media have often not linked extreme weather events to climate change, because you can't tell for an individual extreme weather event was this due to climate change or not, but you can clearly see the increase in extreme weather events due to global heating, and the physical reasons behind that are also largely understood.
Let's be honest. Here in Europe, most people have at most limited experience of the crisis's impact. Not so in many parts of the global south, where sea level rise, glacier melt, and/or drought are destroying people's homes and livelihoods. Our report takes us to the Andes.
The glaciers above Chapaya are shrinking, just one consequence of global heating. That means less glacial water to last through extended periods of drought. Rivers and the soil are drying out. For millennia, the Chapaya people have lived on this barren Andean plateau, but now their survival is in doubt. One plant species has always grown in the dry saline ground, quinoa, a protein-rich grain. But in recent years, extreme weather has destroyed the quinoa harvest, and heavy rains have inundated large parts of the territory.
It's getting worse. The extremes are more frequent. Because of the floods, we've built a levee around the village. Without it, the water would destroy all the houses.
For some years now, young Chapaya have been moving away. Now, as climate change undercuts their subsistence, many of their elders are thinking about following. They're fleeing the weather extremes. But where to?
Where to, indeed. Alan, would you say that Europe and also perhaps North America are prepared for a major influx of climate change-driven migration?
Well, we're obviously not prepared because we almost collapsed here in Europe politically when we had to do with Syrian migration, which was driven by a civil war and brutality of of the regime in Syria. And so no, we're not prepared, and we can't be prepared, and we should do everything we can to prevent this migration for the simple reason that these people are needed, especially the young people, to change things where they are. I heard a statistic that 31% of Africans would prefer to move away from their continent. Now, these are the young, ambitious, like in your clip, people who want a better life. And we have to, simply to say, okay, well, we're responsible for climate change in a great deal, so have to take these refugees. We're taking the young, the ambitious, the people who want to change things away from where they are needed to change things for them. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't take in refugees who come from, for instance, like Syria, but I am saying that we need to do much more to enable them to combat climate change and adapt to climate change where they are. And that includes, by the way, getting rid of or helping them get rid of the corrupt governments which don't do anything for them, neither in the field of vaccination against diseases, nor in the field of helping them deal with drought, nor in the field of democratization, who simply take away the wealth from them. So it's a complex problem. You're not going to help the Africans deal with climate change unless you help them get democracy so that their will can be imposed on their corrupt leaders.
Let me just ask you one thing about democracy, because your opening statement said that we need to preserve democracy and the promise of a good life at the same time that we're fighting the climate crisis. So migration is inevitable. Indeed, we need to work on causes, but it's inevitable. Doesn't that possibly represent a threat to the very democracies here in Europe and North America that you want to preserve? We've seen what kind of strains migration is already imposing.
Well, to be quite frank, it's not migration that destroys or endangers democracy. It's right-wing politicians who use migration as a club to batter democracy for their own nefarious ends.
Won't that happen?
But that will happen. That's one reason why we have to control migration, whether we like it or not, because, simply opening the borders isn't going to work politically. But I think the more important reason is, if you don't help people there... I mean, look at Syria. They're not going to do anything about climate change because they're too busy dodging bombs, and when the bombs aren't falling anymore, rebuilding their lives. So we need a comprehensive support for democracy, for development, and for protection of climate for these countries, rather than saying, okay, you guys, your countries are ruined, come here. That's not going to work.
I think the debate is going in the wrong direction. Yes, we are the main contributors to climate change. The global north just has to accept this position that they have in the world and change that, because it cannot be that we, the people of the global north, produce the most CO2 and that people in the global south are suffering from it. Additionally suffering, as they have suffered through colonialism and exploitation from us for the last centuries. So yes, this is just another problem we are laying upon them, but it is one that we can control, that we have the financial ability to control. So we have to tackle this issue now and fast.
And in fact, absolutely. Clara, as you know, part of the COP process has also been a fund to help people in the global south both adapt to climate change and mitigate the damages that they're facing. Is that fund, in your opinion, adequately financed and supported by the rich countries?
No, because we are the main contributors of climate change. And if we actually, truly want to accept our position and change something about that, we have to direct all of our capacities to solving the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is a social crisis. And as soon as we see that, we can see that all issues that we have right now are directly linked to this crisis, and that this is what we have to solve right now and on a global level. And Germany and Europe, as certain financial and political leaders of this world, have a responsibility to tackle this crisis and to lead the fight now.
Stefan, if I can, you're welcome to respond to that, but also if I can just take us back to the report one more time, because your research is all about catastrophic effects. And I wish you would just please tell us what you are seeing in terms of the magnitude of climate-caused impact right now, and what you think we will be looking at in the next 10 years. So, number of people likely to be displaced, and other, perhaps, basic facts in a nutshell.
Well, the number of people that are likely to be displaced is very difficult to estimate, obviously. But since you mentioned Syria, I should mention that the mass protests and unrest there broke out after the worst drought in the Syrian history, which, according to sediment data from the Eastern Mediterranean, was the worst in at least 900 years there, which led to harvest failures, the cattle dying, and 1.5 million interior refugees in Syria, which also contributed to the stress and dissatisfaction with the government, which didn't help the victims of the drought. But where this will strike next and at what extent is very difficult to say. But drought is certainly one of the risks that I worry about most, including a major food crisis. Colleagues of mine have just published a study that shows that there is an increasing risk of synchronous drought in the main bread baskets of the Northern Hemisphere. And if that happens, we are going to be in for a major food crisis. Then another thing that we worry a lot about is the tipping points in the Earth system where self-amplifying effects happen. We already see that out of the 15 tipping elements that have been identified in the climate system, 9 are active in the sense that are moving towards a critical tipping point. For example, for the complete loss of the Greenland ice sheet, which would take a very long time, but it could be triggered below 2 degrees. Or we see a slowdown of the Gulf Stream system in the North Atlantic, which has been long predicted, and we're now seeing evidence that it has slowed down already by about 15%, which means that the Northern Atlantic is the only region on the globe that has actually been significantly cooling in the last 100 years, while the whole rest of the planet has been warming. And there are major risks for our forests, for example. We see the Amazon forest is under threat. We now see big wildfires in Australia, where I have spent 6 months on a guest professorship. So that's where it's very close to home for me. When I see my friends and colleagues in Australia, Sydney under a cloud of smoke, and massive fires, wildfires spreading there. These are just... I could go on.
Let me ask you about the timetable, because the UN's body of scientists, the IPCC, has issued some pretty dire warnings about the amount of time that we have to try to get on a track that would be, at least to some degree, sustainable. What's your take? How much time do you think we have, in a word?
Very little. If you see that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we only have a remaining emissions budget of 340 gigatons, and we are emitting 40 gigatons each year. That means at current emissions level, after 8 years, we would have run out of any more possibility to emit CO2. And Greta Thunberg I credit her very much to mention these numbers every time in her speeches, which are, of course, the IPCC has published them already more than a year ago. Right. And nobody takes them seriously, apparently, but that's not an opinion, that's the best science we have.
So, Alan, the UN COP process, the Paris Treaty and the Conference of Parties to the treaty that try to put policies in place, that is the main vehicle by which the so-called world community is hoping to turn things around. When you look at what's happened over the last 2 weeks, how hopeful are you that this process can be successful? And I say that with a focus on carbon markets, which have been, in fact, the dominant topic of this past week.
Oh dear. And how hopeful. You know, I hope we'll be clever enough as a species to avoid our own extinction, right? We have done in the past. Look, it's an interesting thing that this COP, this conference, this UN conference, had to move from Chile to Madrid because the government in Chile was no longer stable. Why were they no longer stable? Because they put up the price of gasoline, which is something we're demanding, right? And it led to a people's rebellion. Now, these are the problems we have to deal with, right? I mean, I think really we can agree on the fact that we really need to stay under 2 degrees global warming, and that means definitely getting CO2 emissions down, and that means any kind of burning of fossil fuel is really a stupid idea and a bad idea and almost a criminal idea. But when you actually try to do it, if it's Mr. Macron in France, if it's the government in Chile, if it's the government in Tehran, if it's the government in Iraq, people are demonstrating. And of course, we're not doing that here. But what I'm saying is we have to bring the people along with us. I mean, obviously, the government in Tehran is not going to do that because this is a dictatorship, but we have to do it too if we don't want the kind of things that are happening in Chile or happened last year in France. That's what I'm saying.
Well, it has to be done in a socially just way. Otherwise, we won't succeed with climate protection. And the Potsdam Institute has, of course, made a report for the German government on how to do carbon pricing, which included a carbon dividend. That means that the money that the government takes in by a higher carbon price would be given back to the people on a per capita basis, so that the low-income earners at the end of the year, they have more money in their account, and it's the high-income earners which will carry a proportionately larger burden, which actually still is a tiny fraction of their annual income.
Clara?
Yes, I agree. The examples you mentioned had no social balance whatsoever, but it's important that we reach climate justice because that is our actual goal. And what we see right now is if we don't act now, we will not have a smooth passing to the next climate best option. The longer we wait with the actions we take, the more radical and the more drastic they have to be compared to our lifestyle right now. So acting now is the less radical thing to do.
Apropos lifestyle, Germany just released statistics showing that there are more SUVs on the roads in this country than ever before. So we have a whole lot of Germans joining climate activism protests. At the same time, are we seeing real concrete evidence of people changing their consumption habits? I know your opening statement said that it's corporations and policymakers who need to move first. But given the role of lobbies and given the coziness between many policymakers and, for example, the auto industry in Germany, do you really think that consumers can afford to wait for them to get wise?
I think it's very important not to mix the topics of consumption and production. Because what I always say is, the grandma driving her car to the supermarket because she can't walk anymore, and the disabled person who uses a plastic straw because otherwise he can't drink, those are not the main polluters. The main polluters are the large corporations, and that is why we need legislation to prohibit them from producing CO2 emissions or, let's say, SUVs, or generally products that harm our environment to a large extent. Yes, we need a change in the mindset of people, and that is, I think, Fridays for Future's responsibility to a certain extent, because we try to set the ground for legislation. We try to get the acceptance in society so that legislation is supported by the people.
You called, Alan, for the balance between, well, essentially also for climate justice. If you look at German energy policy and climate policy, don't we see all kinds of contradictions that illustrate exactly why this is so difficult? On the one hand, a very moderate rise in carbon pricing so that consumers would pay more for fuel. On the other, rebates to commuters. How in the world is that going to change behavior?
I don't know. I mean, German climate policy has been a zigzag policy, to put it mildly. I mean, it was probably a really bad idea to try to get out of coal and nuclear at the same time. It was a really bad idea to force people to put 10% ethanol in their cars' tanks, and which led to maize being a monoculture of maize in the countryside. There's lots of things that we're really doing wrong. It's a process of trial and error. Other countries won't have to go through that. So in a way, I don't understand about the giving commuters money. Don't understand it at all. But it seems to be totally counterproductive. This is only one of many counterproductive things that we're doing. I hope other people will learn from our mistakes.
I'm afraid I'll have to stop us right there. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. See you in 3 weeks when we come back from holidays.